Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow from RCI Recording Studios, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the concept of pitch. We've gone over some rhythmic elements, or the duration, the time elements of music, and so all music is made up of pitch and duration, and so today we're going to get into the pitch concept of that equation, okay? So to start out, I guess we'll just give a quick definition, and essentially the definition of pitch is the quality to discern between a high tone or a low tone. And we'll get kind of into that later, but a tone in this case we'll just refer to as a musical note, or whether something sounds higher or lower. For instance, if I strum this low E string on the guitar, that's a pitch. If we play the C, that's a little higher, right? And depending on what instrument you're using, if you're playing a bass, you can get even lower tones or lower pitches, and if you're playing say like a violin, you can get even higher pitches, or even on a guitar you can get higher pitches. Right? And that's what pitch is. It's kind of like the high and low quality of what in theory we call notes. Now, in music theory, we give these notes names, and it's not super necessary to understand the underlying science behind it, but it might be a little helpful for some of you out there, so we'll just briefly touch on it, but this is not by any means anything you need to memorize or really even know to write and create music. It just might be helpful background, but when we play a string on a guitar, what's happening is the string is vibrating, and those vibrations can be measured in something called frequencies. And those frequencies are what determine the note or the pitch. So a faster vibration is going to create a higher pitch. A slower vibration is going to create a lower pitch, okay? And that's any musical instrument. It's just the frequencies are measuring the vibrations that are happening, right? And so when we're tuning instruments, at least in Western music, modern Western music, we tune to the calibration of 440 hertz, which is the note A, which is right here. All right? So that's 440 hertz, that pitch, and we call that 440 hertz the note A. All right? So in music, there are 12 notes that are the building blocks of all music. There's well, it's going to be kind of tricky to go through all of it without giving some underlying things, but in shorthand, every scale in music, and a scale is just a collection of notes, all right? Every scale has 7 notes, and those notes are, generally speaking, going to be A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, all right? And then it repeats. When it comes to the other 5 notes, that's when we're adding in stuff like flats and sharps, and depending on which key you're in, and we'll get more into keys later, but depending on which key you're in is going to determine whether your notes have flats or sharps or what have you. To understand what sharps and flats are, first we need to understand something called half steps and whole steps. So if we were to start here, and we'll just start with A, we'll make it real simple alphabetically. We have an A here. All right? If we go up a half step, now we're raising the degree of A by a half step. That's going to be called an A sharp. A sharp, A sharp. That is a half step, all right? In music, there are half steps and whole steps, and we add those together or have different formulas to create what are called scales, or collections of notes that belong together. And then from those scales, we can derive chords, we can derive all sorts of useful information. Again, none of this is super necessary to know in order to write music, but it probably will help you communicate with other musicians. I think I've said this before in other videos, but when it comes to music theory, it's not really a how-to guide when it comes to writing music. It's more a language that allows you to communicate with other musicians. It's like if I went to France, if I wanted to understand what the French people were saying, it would behoove me to learn the French language. Well, if you want to communicate with other musicians, it would probably be helpful to learn the language of musicians, and they call that language music theory. All right? So anyways, in music theory, we have our half steps and our whole steps. So a half step would be going from an A to an A sharp. And a sharp just means you are going up one half step from whichever note you started with. So in this instance, we start on the A. To make it sharp, we go up one half step, and that makes it an A sharp. Conversely, if we want it to be a flat, if we start on an A and we go, a flat means to go down in pitch by a half step. That means we're going to be on an A flat. So if we go from A to an A flat, we're lowering the pitch. Sharp will raise the pitch by a half step. A flat will lower the pitch by a half step. And that's where flats and sharps come into play. All right? We also have things called whole steps. And a whole step, as you might imagine, is instead of doing one half step up or a sharp, you're going a full step up. In this case, we're going to the next letter of our musical alphabet, which is from an A to a B. So that's a whole step. A, B. All right? When we put formulas together, that's what's going to help us create, and these formulas are derived of whole steps and half steps. That is what's going to give you your all the notes that belong together in any key or scale. All right. So in the key of A, there are 7 notes. Those notes are A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, and then A. All right. Now we'll get into why that is, but it all has to do with formulas. All right, and that is a major key scale, and that's what we're going to focus on to start with. There are a whole bunch of scales out there, and we might get into some of those, but really all you need to know in order to start writing music is the major scale, and you can start writing music and melodies and come up with some great things just based off of the major scale. All right, and the major scale essentially has a formula for whichever note you happen to be starting on. In this case, we were starting on the A, right? And if we start on C, it's going to be a different thing, but it's going to all go back around. So like, for instance, the key of C, your notes are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. All right? No sharps or flats. That's why a lot of people prefer the key of C, because it has no sharps, no flats. You don't have to think about any of that kind of stuff. But you do know, but you may have noticed if you were watching my hand movement here, my finger movement, that each of these notes is going up either a full step or a half step in order to get to the next note in the scale. And again, a scale is just essentially a collection of notes that belong to each other, that belong together, okay? And we'll get more into that in the future as well. The formula for a major scale is a whole step. So let's start on C again, just because it's the simplest. We have C, we have D, which is a whole step, we have E, which is another whole step. So whole step, whole step. Then we have F, which is a half step. Then we have D, E, F, G, which is a whole step up from F. So whole step, half step, then whole step to the G, a whole step to the A, a whole step to the B, and then a half step back to C. So a major scale formula is whole, 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 half, whole, half. All right, so that's two W's for whole. In this case, whole is spelled W-H-O-L-E, and so the shorthand for the formula might be W-W-H for half, so W-W-H, W-W-W-H, all right? And that's two whole steps, one half step, three whole steps, one half step. That is the major scale formula, no matter what note that you're beginning with, all right? And every scale is generally, 90% sure anyways, that every scale has 7 notes in it in total. 8 if you count the octave. And octave, octagram, 8. Octave is the 8th note. It's the same note, but an octave higher or lower. So here's a C, here's a C, up 1 octave, all right? And there's 12 total notes between octaves if you do half steps between each one, and that would be called a chromatic scale. Chromatic scale, I guess, is the exception to the 7-note rule, but that has all 12 notes in it. And with a chromatic scale, we're going to just use sharps to delineate this, although you could make it flats if you really wanted to. But you have A sharp, B, B sharp, or C. There's a B sharp and a C are the same thing. I know this can be a little confusing, but it will all make sense as we go through this a little bit longer, all right? But for right now, we're just going to call it a C, but we have an A sharp, B, B sharp or C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, E sharp or F, F sharp, G, G sharp, and then back to A. So that is a chromatic scale, and that just means we're hitting every half step and we're hitting all 12 notes that exist in music, okay? And as you might have noticed, some of the notes share names. And depending on what key you're in, the same pitch might actually be called by a different note name. For instance, we had in this example, a B sharp could also be called a C. It's the exact same pitch, but depending on which key you're in, and we'll get more into keys later, but depending on which key you're in, will determine whether or not that note is actually called a C or a B sharp. Now, 90% of the time, it's just going to be called a C, but every now and then you might call it a B sharp. And then the same thing applies to the E sharp. Sometimes you'll have an E sharp, but more often than not, it's just going to be called an F. All right, same pitch. You can either call that pitch an E sharp, and you'd be right, or you can call it an F, and you'd be right, depending on which key you're in. Now, each note has its own scale. Well, how do I put this? If you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then all the sharps and flats in between, each one of those starting pitches or starting notes will have a corresponding scale to it, and those scales are the key, essentially. K-E-Y, key. And it will tell you what key the song is in and what scale you ought to use, technically, while you're in that key, okay? So I went over all the notes in the key of A towards the beginning of the video. You also have a key for A sharp. A sharp could also be called So if we have this as A and A sharp, then we have a B. Well, if we want, we can also call this A sharp a B flat. So it's an A sharp or a B flat, and it just depends which key you're using or what your starting note is. All right. So, and you can determine what scale to use or which key you're in by figuring out what note you want to start on. So if we start on A and we use our whole, half, whole, half formula, that will give you all the notes that happen to belong in the key of A. If we start on the note C and we use that same formula, that's going to give you all the notes that belong in the key of C. If you start on a B flat and you use that same formula, that's going to give you all the notes that belong in the key of B flat. If you and B flat and A sharp are the same pitch, so you can either say be in the key of A sharp, or you can be in the key of B flat. In determining, there's no real right or wrong, although technically it probably makes more sense to be in the key of B flat because it allows you to avoid stuff like double sharps and double flats. But that's a whole other conversation. We're not going to get into that right now. The important thing to know, the important thing to take away right now is that there are groups of notes that belong together. We call those groupings scales. The first note of that scale is the key of the scale, all right? The starting note is the key. So if we're starting on A, then you're in the key of A, and the scale will be A major with the formula I gave you, that whole, half, whole, half, all right? I guess another aspect when it comes to scales is that every letter of the musical alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all need to be represented, and you cannot repeat them when you're coming up with scales. And that's just probably, I didn't create this theory, I'm just kind of regurgitating it, probably poorly at this point. I hope that this is all making sense to you so far. But every letter in that alphabet must be represented, and you don't want to have the same letter happen twice. So I could come up with some examples of this, but it's not super important right now, and it's not really even super important that you understand all of the individual scales and notes and things like that, as long as you have the basic concept that there are 12 notes in music. In any major scale, you're using 7 of those 12 notes, and the key of the song you're in is going to be based off of the first starting note of the scale you are using. So if your first note of your scale is C, then you're in the key of C. If the first note of your scale is G, then you're in the key of G. And you have a major scale, which you can use the formula whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. That's 2 whole steps, then a half step, 3 whole steps, then a half step. And you can hear that the pitches are getting higher as you go up the scale and lower as you go down the scale. All right? And then octaves are the same note, but they are differentiated by pitch. One is a lower pitch, one is a higher pitch. All right? And in music, there are several octaves that exist. We'll get more into that later. It's not super important to know that quite yet, but for instance, here's an A, here's an A, here's an A. All right, all 3 of those notes were A, but the pitches of them were higher or lower. All right, but we call it the same note. And for you musical nerds out there like me, you know that the reference point for when it comes to tuning and things of that nature, when it comes to Western music, 440 hertz is an A, all right? And every note has its corresponding frequency that's measured in hertz. So anyways, we're going to dig more into this, and we'll probably have, I'm going to try and bring up visual aids when it comes to these things, but next week we're going to go into how to come up with chords and how that relates to the scales that we've gone over so far. And when it comes to individual notes, and then you have chords. Chords are multiple notes stacked together and played at the same time, and notes are just the individual pitches. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful. We'll get more into chords next week, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you for watching. Bye.